Earlier this year, Donald Trump and Elon Musk committed a murder. Together, the two of them killed the United States Agency for International Development, USAID.
It's been run by a bunch of radical lunatics, and we're getting them out. USAID, run by radical lunatics. And
what we find is an enormous amount of fraud and graft.
Okay, let me put this example to you.
Very little of it actually gets to the kids, if anything at all.
Okay.
Killing off America's primary source of foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief was the right thing to do. Because, well, I'll let Elon Musk explain it.
An apple has got a worm in it, maybe you can take the worm out. But if you've got actually just a ball of worms, it's hopeless. And USAID is a ball of worms. Mm-hmm. There is no apple.
But, they said, there was no reason to worry. The president and the planet's richest man said the rest of the world would be just fine.
There's great economic potential in Africa, like few other places in many ways. In the long run, this will be far more effective and sustainable and beneficial than anything else that we can be doing together.
Now, it's been nearly a year since USAID's operations were shut down, so I want to break this story down into three big questions. Why was USAID killed? What happened when USAID went away? And what happens next? My name is Justin Lang, and this is Soft Power, a show all about diplomacy, security, aid, trade, spying, and how real politics shapes the world. This week, the story of how America destroyed the globe's most generous, effective, and valuable development program, and how the rest of the rich world isn't much better. The story of USAID really begins with this guy, John F. Kennedy Jr. America had been handing out foreign aid for nearly as long as it had been an actual country, but this wasn't quite formalized until 1961.
A new unified agency for international development is reorienting our foreign assistance to emphasize long-term development loans instead of grants, more economic aid instead of military, individual plans to meet the individual needs of the nations.
But this program was not quite as altruistic as Kennedy made it sound. JFK saw USAID as a tool to counter Soviet influence around the globe, particularly in South America and Africa. For all the talk of freedom and fighting poverty, Kennedy was happy to withhold aid from democratically elected socialist governments and lavish it on right-wing military dictatorships. USAID did mature over time. It shifted away from huge public works projects to small local development and humanitarian assistance. After the Cold War, it moved away from fighting communism to supporting democracy, genuinely this time. More recently, a massive amount of its work was privatized and outsourced to NGOs, charities, and local actors. Christian Ruth, who wrote a book on the history of USAID, argues that for its many faults and its complicated history, the organization has done an incredible amount of good for relatively little money. Even conservatives in America tended to agree that USAID was worth the cash. When the Heritage Foundation released its Project 2025 document last year, a roadmap for an even more radical second Trump administration, it called for about a 20% reduction in USAID's budget. And they did want to make it more aligned with Republican priorities, but nobody was suggesting shutting the thing down. Well, almost nobody. It's no secret that Donald Trump's movement is full of all kinds of conspiracy theorists and hard-right ideologues. And there's one guy who has proven to be incredibly influential and who you've probably never heard of. But to understand why the administration became suddenly radicalized against USAID, you need to understand Mike Benz. Now, Benz is a former State Department official who worked in the first Trump administration. After Trump's 2020 loss, he went to the private sector and became, what else, a right-wing online influencer. Benz's whole shtick is that he claims that social media was constantly censoring conservative voices and that there was this secretive symbiotic relationship between the American intelligence community, the media, big tech, mainstream politicians, and kind of everybody else. By the way, even as Benz was crying censorship, he was moonlighting on big social media platforms as an anonymous white nationalist anti-Semitic troll. It's kind of ironic. But writing under his own name, Benz built out this growing online audience, including some pretty important people. He was telling this ever grander story of spies and spooks everywhere. And in 2024, he turned towards a new target, USAID.
Now, the part that I've left out of this, to avoid confusion, is a big old entity right in the middle of them. That entity is USAID.
The American Foreign Aid Program, Ben said, had been corrupted. Maybe it was laudable to begin with, but it had become a front for the CIA. It was a clandestine service to organize coups abroad. When it funded LGBTQ groups in homophobic countries, it did so to provoke civil war and regime change. When it funded counter-disinformation efforts, it was actually censoring journalism. When it said it was doing public health work to prevent pandemics, it was actually responsible for funding the creation of COVID-19 in a Chinese bioweapons lab.
You know, from all the way down the line, from the unions to the universities, to the for-profit companies, to the media, to the social media, to the terrorist groups, to the, gain of function and, pandemic. I mean, there's, how corrupt does an agency need to be? Drugs, terrorism, pandemics, USAID. And I always say, when it's too dirty for the CIA, you give it to USAID. For a number of reasons. Yeah.
Given all of this stuff, Benz came to a pretty clear conclusion about what needed to be done.
The reason that I believe the current open heart surgery is a no-brainer, and I fully support the total abolition of USAID as an agency.
Now, Benz was shockingly influential. He scored an audience with Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson, two of the biggest podcasters on the planet, but arguably his biggest fan was Elon Musk. For weeks after Trump's surprise election, Musk sat on Twitter, replying to Benz's posts about USAID, writing, wow, and I knew there was something fishy going on. Now, I shouldn't even have to say, so much of this stuff is paranoid, total nonsense. There are bits of it that are true. For example, a company tied to President Joe Biden's son got a small piece of a USAID contract to build energy infrastructure in war-torn Ukraine. Or, for example, another USAID project funded an LGBTQ dance group in Ecuador. Neither of those things are particularly scandalous. But when you put everything together and you set it to ominous music, it can sound really bad. As this fight unfolded, those talking points designed by Benz became the official position of the US government.
My uncle started USAID in 1961 for humanitarian purposes to put our country on the side of the poor. It has been captured by the military-industrial complex. It has become a sinister propagator of totalitarianism and war across the globe. And very few people understand how sinister this agency really is.
As Trump prepared to take over the US government for a second time, Musk was given the extraordinary job of heading up the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency. It would be his job to make cuts, to root out corruption, and to stop waste. And his first target became USAID.
So we do have some breaking news out of Washington, D.C. at this hour. I wanted to share this post by the New York Post stating that USAID staffers have been told to stay out of the D.C. headquarters after Elon Musk said President Trump agreed to shut it down.
On January 20th, 2025, the U.S. government froze all foreign aid pending a 3-month review. Thousands of employees in Washington and around the world were sent home. Lawsuits were filed, and lawmakers pointed out rightly that this was all unconstitutional. USAID was funded by Congress, not the White House.
Just like Elon Musk did not create USAID, he doesn't have the power to destroy it. And who's going to stop him? We are!
But they did not, in fact, stop him. Republicans in Congress agreed to axe some of its funding, while the Supreme Court gave the green light for the administration to cut the rest.
And I would just say a strong message to Democrats who are out there pretending to be outraged about the long list of crap that this administration is cutting, federal waste and funding, like $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala, $6 million to fund tourism in Egypt, $20 million on a new Sesame Street show in Iraq, $4.5 million to combat disinformation in Kazakhstan.
Today, the political and legal fights are, at least for the time being, over. USAID is dead. Now, it's pretty easy to lie about what USAID did because it did so much stuff. It helped provide 1 million Indonesians with clean drinking water. It pulled scores of survivors from the rubble of Syria's 2023 earthquake. It financed safety projects for journalists in Cameroon, and ironically, it combated misinformation abroad. Now, not everything USAID did was good. Over the years, there's been some genuine criticism that individual programs and missions were ideological, ineffective, or wasteful. There have been fraud charges laid against a small number of USAID contractors. But these sort of things are true for every single government agency or department. The one thing you can't criticize USAID for is hiding their work, which of course Musk did anyway.
When they said, oh, well, this is going to help, children, or it's going to help some disease eradication or something like that. And then when we ask for any evidence whatsoever, I say, well, please connect us with this group of children so we can talk to them and understand more about their issue. We get nothing.
But every single grant and award that USAID gave out is published online and fully searchable. Its annual financial statements are audited and reviewed by an inspector general. We know that, last year, USAID got about $44 billion in funding from the US government. Of that, some went to salary costs and overhead. More than half of that money went right out the door in program expenses. Now, there was about $18 billion or so that was not spent last year that was held over to this year, 2025, to fund additional work. That's the money the Trump administration has basically stolen from this foreign aid envelope. Of the money that did get spent last year, there was about $2 billion for democracy and human rights promotion, $9 billion to encourage economic growth, $1.5 billion for education and social services, $2 billion for healthcare, and about $700 million for security assistance. Now, USAID does not do all of this work alone. It partners with local and national governments in other countries. It partners with charities, NGOs, and private corporations. And it's not even the only foreign aid program under the US government. But what we can say about USAID, it's often been the centerpiece of a ton of work done abroad.
Sure. Hi, I'm John Stover from Avenir Health. I'm founder and vice president at Avenir Health and focused on modeling of HIV, family planning, maternal and child health, tuberculosis, etc.
In recent decades, a whole industry has sprung up around foreign aid, and a number of them are trying to figure out how to deliver these aid dollars most effectively to get the most bang for your buck. One of those firms is Avenir Health.
We use the modeling to help national programs, mostly, figure out what they should be doing, how they should allocate the resources they have available in order to get maximum impact.
I figured if I was going to break down the extent of USAID's impact, this was a pretty good place to start.
So I think the short message is first, there's been tremendous progress in the last 30 years in almost all health areas. So I mentioned before that HIV, AIDS-related deaths have dropped by 90%. The number of unintended pregnancies has dropped significantly over the last 30 years. And in maternal and child health, child deaths of children under 5, have also dropped by 80% or so over the last 30 years. Much of that is due to international foreign assistance for these health programs.
Now, the US government does not deserve all of the credit for these enormous strides, but it deserves a lot. And unfortunately, we got a really good sense of how important this funding was when it was suddenly stopped.
Yeah, that was quite a shock. The first announcement we had was that foreign aid was put on a pause for 3 months.
John explained to me that most of the clinics his firm works with in Ethiopia, Mali, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, they had enough medication to get by for a few months.
A bigger issue for the 3-month pause, however, was the personnel, because USAID also supported lots and lots, thousands of health personnel that delivered these services. And they were all furloughed on day one. So all of a sudden, clinics were closed. People could go there, but they might have been commodities at the clinic, but they couldn't get their contraceptives or their ARVs because there was nobody manning the clinic.
One of America's most significant foreign aid programs is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR. It provides life-saving drugs to those living with HIV and AIDS.
The deaths from AIDS were, mounting. And life expectancy in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa had dropped from, say, 65 down to 45. It dropped 20 years loss of life expectancy because so many people were dying of AIDS in their 30s and 40s. So that had all kinds of consequences, not only for those individuals and their families, but their children. There was a crisis of orphanhood.
PEPFAR is administered in part by USAID, but it actually has its own budget. Just the same, its $5 billion in funding was put on hold in January with the rest of the foreign aid spending. And it is perhaps the most crystal clear example of how effective American foreign aid really was.
So 20 million people living with HIV were living because of PEPFAR funding. So if that funding went away entirely, all 20 million of those people would be expected to die within the next 6 or 7 years.
And it's not just HIV and AIDS treatment. John and his team modeled out what the impact would be if funding was cut for contraception, maternal health, and tuberculosis treatment. In a study published in The Lancet, he estimated the death toll from these cuts could reach 8 million people by the end of the decade. He also estimated this would leave 11 million children orphaned. A similar study estimated the possible death toll from even a 30% reduction in funding. They put the figure at 500,000 deaths each year. Now, I should say, the Trump administration has offered some bridge funding for some of the most critical programming, including PEPFAR, but even PEPFAR is looking at a 40% budget reduction. And this is really just scratching the surface of these cuts. Last year, the US government allocated about $70 billion in foreign assistance. Much of that flowed through USAID, but not all of it. We still don't know the extent to which the Trump administration intends to reduce that spending further, but the administration has already slashed about half that number, and they're aiming to reduce it by tens of billions of dollars more. Now, some people have been optimistic that the moderates, the so-called adults in the room, like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, might succeed in preventing the worst of these cuts. But given that Rubio was more than happy to sit down with Mike Benz and celebrate the demise of USAID, should not give us much reason for optimism.
And everything we do, you have to understand that when you create something, what you created and what it turns into are not necessarily the same thing, especially when the people in charge change.
A Frankensteinian monster that
that's
takes
right.
on a life of its own.
Donald Trump does get one thing right about foreign aid. Or at least kind of right. The rest of the world has spent decades not pulling their weight and expecting America to do everything. In 2015, the world's richest countries made a pact. They would each spend 0.7% of their gross national income on foreign aid. Now, this was in the name of making the world healthier, richer, and more prosperous. Turns out, most of those countries were lying. On average, these rich countries are less than halfway to their goal. The US government by far spends the most in terms of dollars, but as a proportion of its economy, it spends just 0.2% on foreign aid, and that was before these cuts. Canada, New Zealand, Japan, they're right around the average of 0.3%. Norway, Luxembourg, Sweden, and Denmark are the only rich countries to hit that 0.7% target, although Germany's pretty close. But this data, it's a couple years old. What we've seen over the last 12 months is a sudden, steep reduction in global foreign aid and humanitarian assistance.
So I have been a humanitarian for well over a decade, and these past 11 months are absolutely without precedent. Hi, my name's Gemma Connell. I work for the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, known as OCHA. We work globally to coordinate responses to humanitarian crises and to galvanize humanitarian funding to make sure we can provide that lifeline across the humanitarian community to people around the globe.
OCHA is one of those agencies that delivers this aid directly on the ground, and which was, up until recently, doing so alongside USAID and its partners. Both those agencies have, for example, been delivering millions of meals into Gaza as the world races to stop the deadly famine occurring there under the threat of a possible genocide as well. Gemma told me that they were facing deep cuts to their budget last year, before Trump even took office.
Now, what that means concretely is that as of today, we have more than 40% less funding at this moment than we did at the same time last year. And on the ground, that has catastrophic consequences for the people who we serve. So we're talking about thousands of health facilities that have been shut down or have had their activities suspended. In South Sudan alone, over 200 nutrition treatment facilities have had to shut down. We're talking about people not being able to receive food assistance, and we're talking about no hot meals going to people in need in Haiti. We're talking about gender-based violence services being suspended for women in Eastern DRC. So this has been absolutely catastrophic.
Gemma told me they've already had to make thousands of layoffs and that their partners have had to shut down their operations in certain countries and scale back work in others. And while there has been a 40% reduction in funding, there's not been a 40% reduction in need. Far from it.
Right now in this moment is the first time that we've ever had 2 consecutive famines declared, one in Gaza, one in parts of Sudan. And just this week, the experts reaffirmed that in a number of parts of Sudan, there is famine underway.
This problem is not hypothetical or down the line. It's already happening right now.
Even the most life-saving work is at risk right now, right? We've had to hyper prioritize what we're doing throughout the course of this year. And even now we have to face ourselves with, questions such as, do we respond to the displaced person in South Sudan or the displaced person in Haiti? We don't have the money to do everything that literally saves lives.
This is the depressing twist to the story. In recent years, as conflict has raged, natural disasters have been worsened by climate change, and as we recovered from a once-in-a-century pandemic, countries have been actively cutting their foreign aid budgets. This past summer, the consulting firm Seek Development looked at how much these rich countries were contributing in terms of direct development assistance. They calculated the difference between how much these rich countries spent last year, 2024, and how much they're expected to spend next year, in 2026. France and Germany are both looking to reduce their direct development assistance by about 20%. Canada is cutting 25%, and the UK is slashing its budget by nearly 30%. And it's getting worse. Mark Carney, Canada's newly elected Prime Minister, just announced an additional $2.7 billion foreign aid cut over the next 4 years. Now, there are other countries that are looking to step in and fill the void caused by these foreign aid cuts. Russia, as I mentioned in our first video, is making a big power play to become relevant in Africa, particularly through security assistance. But this has already been a disaster and really is a new form of neo-colonialism that is leaving these countries poorer and worse off. And then there is China. Over the past decade, Beijing has made a huge play into the global south. The Communist Party has spent billions of dollars building big critical infrastructure projects and funding development assistance. But here's the thing about China. While it does heavily fund major multinational organizations, which is good, it does not do much direct multilateral foreign aid. Over the past decade, Beijing spent about 15% of what America does on direct assistance. When it does engage, it does so selectively and often with overtly political and ideological aims. Or worse yet, it drives development thanks to huge high-interest loans. As Yun Sun, an expert on China's foreign policy, wrote earlier this year, China will try to exploit the gap left by USAID, but it is extremely unlikely to fill it. The Trump administration ostensibly sees China as a strategic threat, and yet it seems totally disinterested in actively competing with Beijing for influence. At the end of the day, national governments are trying to manage trade wars and inflation, mounting debt, and populist movements. And citizens are inclined to believe all that misinformation and all those conspiracy theories because they rarely see the actual impact of those foreign aid dollars. And when they see poverty and suffering at home, they think there's no way that we've got enough resources to possibly help out everybody. In that context, these foreign aid cuts are so easy to make. But we live in a globalized world. A war in Europe drives up gas prices here. A failed state in Haiti or Libya means waves of refugees arriving at our doors. A civil war in Myanmar means fewer critical minerals for your phone or your laptop that you're watching this on. More importantly, we're talking about real human beings. And for all of their problems, rich Western nations are wealthier than they have ever been. But these cuts are politically popular because when foreign aid is successful, you never really hear about it or see the benefits. That's kind of a good thing.
And a really recent example is in Somalia during the horrific Horn of Africa drought that went from 2020 to 2022. We had such back-to-back failed rainy seasons and so many complexities that meant that people were literally at risk of famine. But we know we were able to play a significant role in preventing that famine from happening, and we've documented that. Thousands of people died, but tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands more would have died if we weren't doing what we did on the ground in Somalia during that drought.
The Trump administration, totally captured by these conspiracy theories, is unlikely to back down voluntarily. But Congress still, at least ostensibly, has the power to push back and even undo these cuts. But it would be frankly irresponsible to make plans around hoping that the US changes course. And while encouraging private donations, particularly from the rich, is absolutely good, it's just never going to fill up that gap left by these hundreds of billions of dollars that are missing from the global aid budget. Facing a retreating America, NATO countries have been racing to spend more on defense, in some cases doubling their military budgets to 5% of GDP. And yet those same governments have been backing down from the paltry goal of 0.7%. There is, luckily, a pretty clear and easy solution here. Countries should immediately increase their aid budgets to meet the commitment they made a decade ago. Hit the 0.7%. That is it for this episode of Soft Power. Thank you so much for watching to the end, and please like this video and subscribe to this channel. If you haven't already, go back and watch our first video. It's all about Russia's cynical power play in Central Africa. This episode was written and hosted by me, Justin Ling, and edited by Conway Gaskin. This show is made possible thanks to a very generous grant from Bigger Than Our Borders. For more on them, head over to biggerthanourBorders.ca.